Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. Welcome to Sign for More Injury Funding, the podcast for all who want to learn about legal funding and its significance in the personal injury, product liability, medical malpractice, workers' compensation, trucking law, rideshare, and many other types of law practice domains. I'm your host, Laura, founder and CEO of More Injury Funding, the legal funding counselors with passion for law, medicine, legal funding, and heart for all suffering individuals. In today's episode, I have an honor to be talking to the attorney Shawn Daniels with Daniels Law Firm PLLC in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and also licensed to practice in Oklahoma. With over 30 years of personal injury trial experience, Daniels Law Firm provides compassionate representation during the toughest times. Mr. Daniels and his team thoroughly investigate each case while handling insurance companies, allowing the injured plaintiff to focus on healing. Clients can count on this team to keep them informed through the entire process. Today, we'll be discussing the aspects of a product from shelf to courtroom and the journey of a product liability claim. At the end of our episode, I prepared a fun pop-up question for our guests, so stay tuned. Without further ado, let me introduce you to Shawn Daniels. Shawn, take the stage.
Thanks, Laura. I'm glad to be here. I'm here in Fayetteville, Arkansas, but we practice. I'm licensed in both Arkansas and Oklahoma, but practice throughout the country. I have cases in multiple other states, and that's because of the nature of my practice, which is products liability.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things you had wanted me to talk about early on was, kind of the aspect of products liability and why it's important for consumers. And I was getting ready this morning, it kind of dawned on me. First thing I do when I get up is I go to the coffee maker and make a pot of coffee. I get ready, I shave. I mean, so we're confronted with products every day of our life. When I get in my car and I drive to the office, that's another product. And so to me, that's one of the interesting aspects of products liability, because literally every moment of our life, we are affected by the products that are around us. And as consumers, we rely on the manufacturers to make a reasonably safe product. And so that's kind of how I got into this, the fact that it affects so many people. I mean, there's certain things where you don't have that kind of exposure to everybody, but literally every day, every single one of us is affected by products liability. Whether hopefully we don't get any bad effects, but we're all there every day. We are being exposed to product safety.
Very interesting. Yeah, it sounds like products are, mine and your life, and that's what you work with. Especially now with eBay and Amazon, it's we have so much daily exposure to new products that we eventually utilize and use. Shawn, can you explain what product liability law entails and why it's so important for consumers?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of lawyers that practice in whether the bulk of their practice is car wrecks or your personal injury, which products liability is part of the bigger picture of personal injury, but it's a very specialized kind of niche aspect of it. In your typical negligence case, like I say, a car wreck, it's duty, breach of a duty, the other driver was negligent and caused the injuries. With products, you've got specific type of claims. You've got, the product you have to find or prove that the product was defective and in an unreasonably dangerous condition. And that's what makes it really a totally different ball field that you're playing on in products liability cases. If we want to get into it later, we can talk about the negligence, products liability, strict liability, and breach of warranty. But in a general sense, you have to prove that the manufacturer released a product into the stream of commerce in an unreasonably dangerous and defective condition. And it's usually going to be two ways that those things happen. It's either a manufacturing defect or a design defect. And in my experience, the vast majority of your products claims tend to be a design defect, that there was something in the design of the product that made it unsafe, unreasonably dangerous, and defective. And you typically prove that by proving an alternative design that's feasible, that removes that danger or it makes the product safer. Manufacturing, you'll see somewhere along the line in the manufacturing process, something's not getting done. But and we certainly have those, but in my experience, the vast majority of them tend to be design type claims.
Well, since we're talking about the product defects, what are the most common types of product defects that can lead to liability claims?
Well, I mean, again, it would be a design. I'm going to give an example, say, of within the products world. The laws has gotten so specialized over the years. This is my 34th year of practice, and in the old days, you could generally handle about any kind of case. It's certainly in the personal injury world. I've never really done any. I don't think I've ever done a divorce. I don't think I've ever done a criminal case, but but generally, at one time, I would have thought that a personal injury lawyer could handle anything from a truck wreck to a products liability claim to a medical malpractice claim. And in today's world, that's just not saying they can't do it, but it'd be a huge risk.
And very specialized. It became very specialized.
It's gotten so specialized. So in the products world, you have, like say a consumer product, a household product, say, I mentioned a coffee pot, and there's been a lot of these pressure cookers that have been failing and causing injuries. And that's more of a household product, but in a crash worthiness where, and that's the bulk of what I do within the products world are crash worthiness cases involving motor vehicles. And so an example of that would be, I think a lot of us have heard over the years back the old Ford Pinto cases where they put the fuel tank in the very back. That's a classic design flaw. I mean, how that ever got released in that condition where just a minor impact would cause the tank to rupture and fuel to spill, and then you've got the sparks from the metal on metal and fires. That's your classic design defect. That fuel tank should have been put inside, further away from the rear, and then we saw it in the 70s and the 80s with they called them the CK pickups, where they put the fuel tanks outside the frame rail. So any kind of an impact on the side was causing the fuel tank to be damaged and fuel to leak and fires. And again, it's a design defect because you want to protect that fuel tank. And so, most other manufacturers put it inside the frame rail. So you've got some structure to protect that dangerous fuel that you have to have, obviously, but you want to protect it. And those are two examples in the auto world of design defects where fuel tanks were placed in vulnerable, dangerous locations, and that was a design.
Thank you so much for giving these very vividly described examples. So where are the tanks, gas tanks, or fuel tanks placed nowadays?
Well, they usually try to place them all inside the frame rail. So your vehicle sets on a chassis, which it basically has two frame rails down each side, which are kind of pillars type of steel, and then they've got the front and the rear. They've got protection and structure in both of those with the axles. And so you want to place that fuel tank inside that zone of protection. And not only that, but you want to look and make sure that there's not anything sharp near the fuel tank, because we all know that in a collision, all of that metal is going to react. So you got that force being applied. So that force then goes from the striking vehicle, goes into the target vehicle. And as that force goes through, everything is bending, moving in reaction to that force. And so you have to anticipate if there's something near the fuel tank, even if it's inside the frame rails and inside the axles, is there something sharp or something that could puncture or penetrate the fuel tank, could penetrate a fuel line. Another example was the frame rails on a Ford vehicle, and what they would do, they would punch out holes all the way down the side of the frame rails. And the purpose of that was in certain models, extended cabs or four-door pickups, they would put cross members in there. So if you had a 4-wheel drive, you get additional cross members. So to save costs, they would go ahead and pre-manufacture these frame rails with the holes punched out so that they could attach cross members. Well, if you had one of the lower end vehicles and you didn't get the cross member, you had these holes in the frame rail. And we had a client that their vehicle hit some water around a curve and slid off, and it hit an embankment. And of course, the force just happened to be applied at the frame rail where one of these holes had been punched out. And so what happens is the frame rail bent, the hole then where the hole was, it broke. And so you had two sharp edges, and sure enough, it punctured the fuel tank, and the our client was severely burned in that. And again, that was a design defect and a little manufacturing aspect to it as well. But the only reason that was even done was to save a few cents per vehicle, when that hole just created an unnecessary danger for that model that didn't have the cross member. And that's probably a long-winded way of saying that you've got to anticipate. A manufacturer has a duty to anticipate things that could happen, because we all know crashes happen every day. And that's what crash worthiness is about. And as a prudent manufacturer, that these vehicles are going to be involved in crashes. That's why we have seat belts, airbags, and all the other things, because we all know that crashes occur. And so you have a duty, if you're going to go release a product out there into the public, that you have to anticipate and design it so that it's reasonably safe. And putting fuel tanks outside the frame rails or in the back, or punching out holes in frame rails that aren't serving any purpose, that's an example of a poor design and a defective vehicle.
You explained it so well, Shawn. Thank you so much. And it sounds like you studied the engineering of cars really well as well in your line of what you do.
Yeah, it's something I've gotten kind of passionate about over the years. I didn't start off doing products work. I started off doing insurance defense, and I hated it because I always like helping people. I'm going to go way off on a tangent here, and just cut me off if I start rambling. But,
not at all. I love it.
My dad's a large animal veterinarian, and so when I was a kid, all growing up, I would go to the clinic with him, and then he had to get night calls all the time. So during calving season, he would get called all night. I mean, he'd get in, I'd be dead asleep, and he'd pull me out of bed at 1 o'clock in the morning. He'd got there's a cow down and can't deliver. And so I can remember how hard that was on my dad, but I also remember the satisfaction he got by helping these people, because their livelihood depends on a healthy cow and a healthy calf. And if they didn't do that C-section or get that calf pulled, he's going to lose his cow and his calf, and there goes his ability to feed his family. And every year during calving season that would happen. And I remember, how hard it was for him, how tired he was, how tired I was. But I always remember I always liked the fact that the ranchers were always so grateful, and my dad got a lot of satisfaction out of that. And that, in a sense, products liability in crash worthiness kind of gives me the opportunity to have that same thing where, somebody gets catastrophically injured, and their family's devastated. If you take out the main breadwinner of the family, and they can't afford to a lot of them will have future medical care for the rest of their lives, or they've been killed, and the family's just devastated. They've just lost that. And if you can help them in a products case where you get them set up where their future medical is going to be taken care of for the rest of their life, or financially, mom's going to be able to make sure the kids can go to college and all those things. I mean, kind of gives me that same satisfaction that my dad would do when he would save a cow and save a calf, and really helped a rancher's family make it that year, because the margins in the cattle industry can be pretty thin. So you start losing, some of these cows and calves, and a lot of them when they spend a lot of money on, say a registered cow, and they've got this registered calf coming, and I mean it can wipe them out if they have too many of those losses. So again, that's a long way of saying that kind of I think some of my early experiences as a kid has played into why I really like doing products liability work. And
That's
I learned
amazing.
a lot of that from my dad because it
Mhm.
is as a large animal vet. You're out there, out in the pasture in the middle of the night. You're not in a hospital. You don't have all these assistants. You don't have an anesthesiologist there. It's just you, and you can only bring so much with you in your mobile unit. And so the ability to think on your feet, adapt to the circumstances, and that kind of also is a skill set that I've learned from my dad that I've carried over into my practice. You've got to, think on your feet. You've got to be able to adapt. You've got to look at the situation and come up with, all right, what can I do here? And that starts from when, like, I make that initial vehicle inspection. Somebody's car has been burned up on fire or a massive crash, and then one of the first things I do is I go look at the vehicle. And I'm still doing some of those things that I can remember my dad doing. You survey the situation, you kind of look it over. All right, what can I do here? And a lot of that old skill set from way back then is carried me forward to this day, and I still
Mhm.
use a lot of it.
I love it. Your dad sounds like he was an amazing human being, amazing veterinarian, and such a great contribution to this local community. And the best thing, he instilled the work ethic in you, Shawn. That's
He did.
beautiful.
He did. He still does.
That's wonderful. Say hello to your dad for me,
I
please.
will. I will.
So, Shawn, how does the concept of strict liability differ from negligence in product liability cases?
Yeah, well, in negligence, again, it's kind of duty, breach, causation, and when you're bringing a claim for negligence, it's the defendant was negligent, plaintiff was injured, therefore, and it's a fairly streamlined notice type of a claim that you made. In products liability, it's by statute, and so there's your general statutory uh, defenses like misuse of the product, alteration of the product, knowledge of the defect. There's certain specific defenses that the manufacturer uses in products liability that you don't really encounter in a general negligence claim. Having said that, when I make a decision to take on a products liability claim, I will at least initially start off with not only the strict products liability claim, but negligence and typically breach of warranty as well. 'Cause
Mhm.
a lot of times you just won't know. At the time you file it, you've done all you can as far as research and investigating the claim and all that, but there's still going to be a lot you don't know. A lot of that you find out in the discovery process once litigation started. But I will typically plead them all. But most of the time, as the case progresses, I end up honing down to the strict products liability claim, and sometimes I'll even dismiss the negligence claim.
Mhm. Mhm.
It tends to be more focused on the conduct of the parties versus in products liability, you can focus it on the conduct of the manufacturer. And that gets into that thing is that did you look at alternative designs and was this a cost-based thing? So that's typically the direction it goes. You start off pleading, generally all three of those. And then as the case progresses, most of the time I wind up more going down the strict products liability claim.
Mhm. Thank you for again explaining this so thoroughly. Let's talk about the role of plaintiff's attorney when it comes to the product liability cases. What is your role, Shawn, as a plaintiff's attorney in these types of cases?
Well, it's all consuming, and it changes throughout the progression of the case. I mean, typically the first thing is you get a call either from another lawyer, which tends to be most of what my work is. People will call, "Hey, Shawn, I think we may have a products case here," because there's not a lot of people that really focus on those. And over the years, your name gets out there, so I get a lot of calls, and first thing I do is I go out and look at the vehicle. I'll do some research on once I get the make and the model. I'll do some research on some of the sources out there about that, and we can get into that at some point, I guess. But like there's the NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. You can get a lot of information about that particular vehicle from those research. So I usually have done all that I can do there. Go out and look at the vehicle, and those usually take a couple hours because you've got to really look over what you think the defect is, and then was the crash so severe that no vehicle could have withstood it. You've got to look at was the driver belted, all the things that go into evaluating it. But you've got to go in there and look at that, and then you've got to spend a lot of time with the family. Unlike a more I don't want to say run of the mill, but say a car wreck or slip and fall or something like that. The plaintiff in a products case, there's a lot of information you need to find out. And one, for example, did they get a recall notice? Because a lot of times if there's a defect in a vehicle, sometimes the manufacturer will issue a recall notice. And so if they got a recall notice and ignored it, that's a big problem. Or was the airbag warning light, had it been on, and you just kept driving and ignored the warning light? Those things, were you aware of any kind of problems or defects with the vehicle? Have you been taking it in for maintenance and all those kind of things? The things that you don't have to really screen so hard about on another type of personal injury case, but on a products case. So, you've got to really investigate, and you've got to really spend a lot of time with that family, because you got to know their background with the product, where they buy it from, what was told to them at the time they bought it and all that.
Good to know. Shawn, can you walk us through the typical process of filing a product liability claim from a plaintiff's perspective?
Yeah, of course, you've done a whole lot of investigation, because these are products cases. And again, I'm going to focus primarily on crash worthiness. They're very expensive, very, very expensive, because like I say, again, in a car wreck case, sometimes you'll have an expert witness, maybe an accident reconstructionist, but a lot of times you don't. In a crash worthiness case, you are going to have expert witnesses. You're going to have a reconstructionist, and depending on the defect, whether it's a tire or seat belt, fuel system, whatever it is, you're going to have experts specific to that. So you're going to have 2 to 5, sometimes more, engineers that are working on that case. So you've got to have all that in place before you file it, because once you file, you're in. And so I don't take one on unless I'm fully committed to it. That's why I screen them hard, I vet them real hard, and I turn down way more than I take. But to get to that point of filing, I have gone through all that steps. I've looked at the deal. I've had then I'll have the experts look at the vehicle, and you got to have them all lined up first, and then you can file it. Now, I know some people file and then learn as they go, but in my experience, to be successful in these cases, because they're difficult. They're you're down there in the weeds on all these engineering issues, and like I say, they're very expensive. You've got to really do your homework on the front end. So by the time I've got to filing it, I'm pretty solid on, I know what the defect is. I've got an alternative design that was feasible, that made this vehicle a lot safer and would have removed the hazard. And my client didn't have anything like intoxication, not wearing a seatbelt, things of that nature. I've got all that lined up. So by the time I get to filing it, I feel pretty confident that I've got a case. But it's a roller coaster ride once you file, because it's this is a great case. Oh, it's terrible. Oh, it's a great case. Oh, it's terrible. And you just got to kind of persevere and hang in there through that process, because it's a bumpy ride.
Absolutely. So, Shawn, an important question in any case, and particularly in that of product liability, is that of gathering evidence. What types of evidence are crucial for building a strong product liability case?
Like I mentioned earlier, you want to check NHTSA, check for any recalls. They'll have lists of complaints and other things. You want to do the download of the ECM, the electronic control module, or the black box, to find out speeds and when brakes were applied, were seat belts on, did the pretensioners fire, did the airbag deploy, all those kind of things. And then you'll want to also be sure, and this is probably rule number one in product in crash worthiness, you got to secure the vehicle. In theory, you could bring a product's liability or crash worthiness case without the product or the vehicle, but I would never do it. I've heard of it being done, but I would never do it. So you got to get that thing secured, and then you've got to get it, in a secure place. If you leave it out in the elements, then, we had a case years ago where the issue was a wheel bearing, and the design of the wheel hub was allowing moisture to get into the wheel bearings. Then they would then corrode and lock up. And so if somebody's driving down the highway at 70 miles an hour and their wheel locks up, they're in a bad situation, and it was causing crashes. So the manufacturer in that case tried to say that, well, all this rust that's on these wheel bearings was caused because the vehicle had been left outside in the elements. And we were able to prove no. We had the receipts and photographs from the wrecker to the storage yard where it was covered, and then to our facility where it was inside. So that it kind of preempted that potential defense. But that's why, you've got to get the vehicle secured. You've got to get the police report. You got to get all the photos. A lot of times the police will take photos. And nowadays, so many police have dash cams and body cam videos, and you've got to specifically request those. And those can be invaluable. We have a seatback case going now where one of the arguments that the manufacturer tried to do is, oh, well, the position of the seat had been altered by the first responder, because when they came in and got the lady out of the car, they reclined the seat. And so what happens in a lot of these seatback cases, a relatively minor impact from the rear where everybody should just walk away from the collision, maybe has a little sore neck, but that's it. This poor lady's seat broke, and she was shot back into the rear seat, and it broke her neck, and she's a quadriplegic.
Oh, goodness.
And so by getting those body cam videos, one of the officers who got to the scene went and talked to her. His body cam captured the whole thing, including the position of the seat before the first responders got there. So without that video, we would have had to deal with this argument that, oh, the seat was not reclined at the time of the impact or after the impact. It was only reclined because the first responders did. And we were able to show when the officer got there, his body cam picked it up and picked up the position of the seat, and it was fully reclined because it broke. So those are the kind of things you got to get as much information and evidence as you can on the front end. And a lot of times people don't think about getting dash cam and body cam videos because those can be critical.
Do you believe that dash cam or dashboard cameras is a good idea for any driver?
I mean, yeah, we've actually had clients that they had one mounted and it proved their case. I don't know if you were talking about somebody just having their own camera in their vehicle.
having their own.
Yeah.
Amazon, eBay.
Yeah. I mean, if you're ever in a collision and there's an argument about who caused it, it can be very helpful. We had one literally where, the car blew. I mean, you can see in our guy, he's got a green light. He's coming through the intersection and the car just comes blowing out. Well, he was trying to argue that he had the light, and he captured the light in his own video. And so it pretty well ended that defense. Yeah, I mean, if you can have one, why not? I mean, it can definitely help in the event you are ever involved in a collision and there's an argument about who's at fault.
One attorney here locally in Georgia, Zach Meeks, he does personal injury and some other cases amongst personal injury, but he is the one who inspired me to get my dash camcorder. Yeah. So since then, for last, 3 months, I've been driving and feeling so more safe per se,
I think it's a good idea. Yeah, I mean, and certainly, like I say, if you're ever in a crash and there's an argument about who's at fault, I mean, you'll wish you had one. No, there definitely is a good idea.
Shawn, how do you investigate a product's defect or failure, and what resources do you utilize? When they say resources, tools, software, apps, vendors.
Well, again, I'm going to keep going back to NHTSA. They're a very good resource in vehicles. Then there's the Consumer Product Safety Commission, I believe is what it's called. I have to look those up every time I do it. CPSC, Consumer Product Safety Commission. So for non-vehicles, that CPSC is a good source because they'll have all kinds of information. I mean, there's recalls and other products. There was I'm sure you remember years ago, and I guess it's still going today, but there was that TVM, the mesh that they were implanting all the time, and there was all kinds of problems with it.
Mm-hmm.
That CPSC was a really good resource for people because it would identify all the patients that were having complications from it, and it would identify them by manufacturer, and you could literally pull up every complaint that had been filed. And so that's a great resource for people and lawyers to look at when you're investigating a products case, to look at those kind of things. And those kind of go back to what we call them OSIs in the products liability world, other similar incidents.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things, and you can do a lot of that on court searches. If there's been a history of other failures that were the same or similar as to what happened to your client, that's a powerful evidence, and so that helps prove that the vehicle or the product is unreasonably dangerous and defective. If you can show that this has been happening all over the country multiple times, and that ultimately that's what you're trying to build are these OSIs, because that gets you a long way down the road as far as proving that the product was unreasonably dangerous and defective.
So I guess you use whistleblower services when it comes to other similar instances.
Yeah, I mean there are experts out there that I have used in the past. Like sometimes, we had a planer one time where a guy got his arm cut off, and it wasn't something that there wasn't a lot of information. It wasn't like a consumer product. It's a very specialty niche deal. They're only in, sawmills and things like that. So there wasn't a lot of information out there publicly available. And I've had this certain guy that I've used before on these kind of cases, and he accessed, and you can do it yourself, but they're just a lot better at it than it would take me, 10 times as long. But he was able to go through like OSHA reports,
Mm-hmm.
and he could search all the OSHA reports throughout the country, and we're able to find a whole bunch of these other similar incidents involving this type of planer, and sometimes the same exact make and model of the planer. And so we developed that evidence showing it was defective there, by using one of those resources that's able to search a lot of these databases that some of us don't always have.
So, Shawn, what are some common challenges plaintiffs face in product liability lawsuits that you or your fellow attorneys encountered or have encountered throughout the years?
The biggest ones are, like I say, that they're complex and they're complicated, and and they're very expensive. You're going to have multiple experts, multiple engineers, oftentimes physician experts as well. And so the cost can easily get into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, just to get the case off the ground and to have a chance at being successful. That's probably the biggest challenge to somebody that, just starting out is, you've got to really, and it shuts you down on a lot of things because these cases have become so big and so time consuming. All of your other files, if you're not working nights and weekends, which most of us have to do, they can get neglected. And so it's a big time and money commitment. And the other problem, kind of unique to products world, is getting good experts. There's not like say again, for an accident reconstructionist, they tend to be multiple. I mean, there tend to be multiple in almost any areas. A lot of, retired police officers and highway patrolmen, go into accident reconstruction. So those are typically easy to find in almost any area. But when you get into specific defects, for example, let's say fuel systems in a vehicle, there's not that many people that are qualified. And in products cases, finding qualified experts is a huge hurdle that you have to clear, because they are going to dauber every one of your experts, try to get them challenged, saying they don't have the qualifications, they didn't do an adequate testing, they'll come up with everything. So you've got to find qualified experts, and there's not that many of them, because the manufacturing world, they typically have either in-house engineers or former engineers that work for them that go into the expert witness business or consulting business. So they've got this pool of experts that they can use for any type of a defect. On the plaintiff side, there's not near as many, and they tend to be just a few, and they're very busy, and you kind of have to have connections and contacts with them to get them on board, and that's a big challenge. Is you've identified the defect, you've looked at the vehicle, you've done all your homework, and then you've got to go find a qualified expert, because they've got to be able to get through the challenge that the manufacturers are going to file against them, saying they're not qualified or their testimony should be stricken. And so it's a much smaller expert pool that's available in products cases than in other type of cases. Even medical malpractice. I mean, there are much more available expert witnesses for a plaintiff in a medical malpractice case than in a products case.
And if you ever need any expert witnesses in any situation, just let me know, since I have connections nationwide.
I will. I'll definitely do it. We're always looking for good ones.
Yes, absolutely. How do companies typically defend against product liability claims, and what tips do you have for plaintiffs counter these defenses?
Well, first off, they defend them very vigorously. In the crashworthiness world, the auto manufacturers, they have teams of lawyers, and they get to specialize. And so if you have a tire case, they'll have a firm or a set of lawyers that they use for tire cases. They'll have a firm that they use for airbags, a firm that they use for fuel system. And again, I'm sorry, what was that? Oh, so they have really qualified attorneys. They have an in-house pool of experts, and they will defend these things to the teeth, because a lot of times what they're going to try to do, they're going to try to dauber challenge all of your experts to say that you can't chin the bar on this claim or that defect. And so because they have that kind of built-in advantage in some respects, they defend them very vigorously. And their client, the manufacturers, their livelihood depends on being able to continue to sell these products. So they don't want to, they won't just, I have not had, in my experience, I've never had a pre-suit settlement in a products liability case. Sometimes you can in personal injury cases. If you've got a really good case and you've worked it up well and you put a really impressive kind of settlement demand together, it happens sometimes, but I've never had it happen yet in the products case. They will always make you prove that to them that you have a good case, that you know what you're doing, and you can handle it all the way through, and you've got qualified experts. They're going to depose all your fact witnesses. They're going to depose all your experts. You're going to have to depose all their experts, and you basically have to have proven that you can win this case. And in my experience, before they'll even entertain trying to maybe resolve the case with you, because they just defend these things to the teeth, and you're going to get in discovery battles. They never want to answer interrogatories or produce data or documents that they clearly should, and so you're going to have to fight all of those things. You're going to have multiple hearings and probably some motions to compel. I mean, it's a long, hard battle.
Very interesting. Well, let's apply some real life example to our discussion. Can you share maybe one success story or two from your practice that highlight the impact of product liability law?
Yeah, I actually thought about one this morning. One of the things that you always get confronted with in products cases are, a manual, whether it's the owner's manual in your car or every product that comes out, there's a manual. And normally what happens in those cases, because they all know in the real world, nobody reads those things. I mean, when you get a new car, that manual is going to be probably 300 pages thick, and nobody reads it. You might consult it if you have a question about, what's my recommended tire pressure. You might open it up and look at that. And they know that. The manufacturers know that. But they stick everything in this manual knowing that nobody will ever read it. And then they typically will use that to beat the plaintiffs over the head with it. Well, if you'd have read the manual, you'd have seen X, Y, Z. we had a case years ago involving an air compressor. And so, you got a connected hose to the air compressor, and it was powering a plant. So instead of having like a tool on the end of it, it connected directly into an air attachment into this plant that ran off compressed air. Their normal compressor was down, so they leased a portable one there to keep the plant running. So when they're done, they're ready to shut down for the shift. Our client, he closes the valve, the gauge on the compressor goes to 0, and then he tries to disconnect the hose. Well, it turned out the hose was under pressure, and as it disconnected, it hit him in the head and caused all kinds of a brain injury. Well, in that case, I'm deposing the in-house expert, their in-house engineer, and he was their kind of end-all be-all guy on these air compressors and how safe they were. And well, in the manual, it said to release pressure, you release through a tool, which there was no tool here, or open and close the valve. And the testimony from the other employees that were there when my client was trying to disconnect is he went to the compressor, he opened and closed the valve, waited for the gauge to go to 0, and then went to disconnect. And I asked him, I said, well, my client did exactly what the manual said he was supposed to do. And he was forced to admit that he was, and that almost never happens. So our guy followed the manual to a T and, was egregiously injured because the pressure was trapped in there. And it all came down because, I could talk about this case for days, but they on these valves, it costs a little bit extra, of course, but they call them safety valves. So when you close the valve, there's a bleed hole that bleeds all the pressure out of the connected hose. But it costs a couple bucks extra. So this manufacturer chose not to put the safety valve on there. So when my guy closed the valve, that air was just trapped. There's no way he was going to be able to release the air in that hose. And it was under pressure. And those things are, they'll kill you if they hit you. Unfortunately, I had a hard hat and still suffered a permanent brain injury from it. But but in that case, the manual, actually, he did exactly what the manual said, even though it was hidden in a plastic sheath back up in the guts of the compressor that nobody would have known was there anyway. He obviously didn't have a chance to look at it. And it was a leased compressor. So, it wasn't like he had it. But it was one of the few times that he actually did what the manual said. And the reason for that was they were so sloppy, not only in not putting a safe valve on the thing, but they just cut and pasted a manual from 20 years ago and just carried it over. They didn't even bother to update the manual or provide any information on how do you disconnect this hose when you don't have a tool on the end of it. So that was one that was always kind of stood out to me that we actually, and the case settled shortly after that. But that was one of the few times where the manufacturer was forced to admit that yes, the plaintiff did exactly what the manual said he was supposed to do.
That's a really great example. Thanks so much for sharing your story there. Not always everything goes as planned in plaintiff's world. What lessons, Shawn, have you learned from cases that did not go as you have planned?
Oh, okay. One that I learned the hard way. You've got to investigate and research your own experts because that the other side is going to challenge their qualifications and look at every transcript that they've ever given. I had a case years ago where my expert, he was certainly qualified, but what I didn't know was that he had testified in a case in North Carolina before my case, and he had testified falsely about some of the things about he was in a vehicle, a rental car, and it had some of the same defects that he was testifying that the vehicle he was on, the case he was involved in North Carolina. What made that car unsafe and defective? Well, he was driving a rental car with the same defect, alleged defect to it. and he had testified falsely about some things like family members or that was in the vehicle with him and whatnot. So I never pulled that transcript. I didn't run that down. And so when I'm presenting this expert in my case, I started noticing there's a lot of really pointed questions about him. I knew something was up.
Mm-hmm.
And I had spent the whole day and night before with him going over his testimony and making sure and all this. It turned out that sure enough, the manufacturer in that case had that testimony, and they were able to damage his credibility so bad. I had to find another expert. And so I learned then, and I do it now, but every expert that I'm going forward with, I do a thorough, I look at every case they've ever testified in. Have they ever said anything inconsistent with what they're saying in this case? And I didn't do that then because he'd been used. I'd actually used him in the past, but it was before the North Carolina case. And I let my guard down a little bit there, and it bit me on that one because I had to basically start all over.
That's a painful experience right there.
Very painful.
Let's shift our focus now to consumer awareness and advocacy for a moment. How can consumers protect themselves from defective products and understand their rights?
Yeah, I mean, again, that CPSC, if you're talking about like, household products and things like that, that's a great resource. There's all kinds of information available on the internet where you can find about where people have blogged about products and complaints they've had or problems they've had. In the real world, we're not all going to be doing that on every little thing we buy. But if you're thinking about a significant or substantial purchase, it makes sense to do your research on that. And there's today versus 20 years ago, there's so much more information out there. You can literally just get in on Google and start searching and find out all kinds of information about products. That's probably the first thing to do. But then when you're talking about like a major purchase like vehicles, that's when you want to go, check the NHTSA and some of those sources and look for recalls or other problems. I wouldn't expect normal consumers to be able to or take the time to do the looking at court cases and whatnot. But I mean, that's one of the things as an attorney I do. I search in every database I can find federal cases, state court cases, and it's time consuming. On Pacer, you can get pretty much any federal one fairly quickly. But when you get down to states, you've got to go to each state and start looking. And sometimes, we'll pick the most populous ones to see and things like that. But for consumers, that's the main thing is that CPSC, about vehicles, check NHTSA, just do what you can find out online.
Good to know. What steps should a consumer take if they believe they have been harmed by a product?
Great question. So, if they have, I mean, the first thing to do is contact a products liability attorney because it is a niche practice and not everyone's, got the experience or the resource to do them. So you want to find one, and sometimes you have to go out of state. I mean, that's why I have cases. I've got one in Tennessee right now. You go to other states. I mean, there's not that many of us out there. And you find one that's got a lot of experience and had a lot of success. And one of the things that I've noticed is, again, especially in the crash worthiness case, a lot of times people don't even know that they have a products case because they'll think, well, Billy drove off the road and he was killed when his car caught on fire, or he was killed in the collision, but it was his fault for he went off the road. Well, that's what crash worthiness is. The vehicle has to be crash worthy. And so I've had people say, well, there's probably nothing here, Shawn, but would you mind looking at this? And I'll go look at it and go, yeah, the airbag didn't deploy, or he burned to death and he had no real orthopedic injuries. And there's an old saying in the crash worthiness world that nobody should ever burn to death in an otherwise survivable collision. And that happens a lot, but a lot of the public don't think anything about it. They think, well, he went off the road and hit this tree and the car burst into flames. And then you look at the vehicle going, there's not that much damage to the vehicle. The passenger compartment's still intact. he should have survived this. And then you get the medical records in, you see that there's no broken bones, there's no anything that was a lot of trauma to the body, and you go, this shouldn't have happened. And so a lot of times people will think because the driver was at fault in causing the crash, that everything that flows from that then on, there's no responsibility other than the driver, and that's simply not true. That's why we, like I mentioned earlier, airbags, seat belts, all these things that are designed to protect the occupant, even in a crash that you could say was the occupant's fault.
What final advice, Shawn, would you give to potential plaintiffs considering a product liability claim?
Well, I mean, it would be to, do your homework. You can't screen these cases hard enough. It'll take me sometimes, a couple months before I can make a decision. And if I'm contacted about one and the statute's real close, I won't take it, because I won't have time to do all my background work on it. And so that's the number one thing is, and talk to plaintiff lawyers or product liability lawyers. I get calls all the time, and somebody wants to say, hey, let me run this by you. And I do it myself. I've been doing this a long time, but there's still times I will call some of my buddies that do products work, and I'll say, hey, what do you think about this? I've got this, 2005 Tahoe, and I'll run it by just to get a new perspective on something. That's probably what I do now more than anything, as far as just kind of getting my mind oriented right about, do I have this case? Because I've done all my work, I've got all the photographs, I've inspected it, I've done all this, and then I want to hear somebody you get so focused on these cases, sometimes you lose sight of the big picture. And that's where I like to talk with other lawyers that do products work to try to get some of the big picture deal. And I'll give you one real quick example. I had one where I got so deep into the weeds about the roll rate. And so if a vehicle goes into a roll, they have these side airbag that deploy. And the purpose of that is to protect the head, so it's not slamming against the A-pillar or the roof rail, or if the wind is down the ground. And this what happened, a car was involved in a collision, and it rolled. The airbag didn't deploy, and the driver's skull had a skull fracture and passed away. And I was getting so caught up because the manufacturer in that case was trying to say, oh, well, the roll rate was X, and it only supposed to deploy if the roll rate's Y. And we were showing that, sure enough, this roll rate should have had a deployment. And so I was actually at a mediation, and another lawyer came by, stopped by, because he knew we were mediating this case. This was out of state. And during one of the breaks, the mediator's in with the manufacturer's lawyers, and they're in there negotiating, haggling, and he talks to me a little bit and goes, what are you doing here? I said, well, it's a side airbag case. It had a rollover and it didn't deploy. And I said, yeah, he goes, yeah, I'm kind of nervous here about this roll rate, as they're saying that the roll rate wasn't sufficient, that it should have deployed the airbag. And he go, and the guy gave me that big world perspective. He said, wait a minute, the car was in a rollover, right, Shawn? Yes, sir. They recalled the vehicle because the airbags weren't deploying in rollovers. Yes, sir. Goes, then what the hell are you doing talking about roll rate? Who cares? The jury's never going to pay that attention. And we got it successfully resolved. But I needed that big picture about, because sometimes you get so focused on some of the little minutia that you lose sight of the case. I mean, they recalled the vehicle because in rollovers, the bags weren't deploying. This car rolled over. The bag didn't deploy. And this lawyer was telling me, there's your case. Don't worry about some of these little details that nobody will ever understand. So that's why I like to talk to other lawyers sometimes. And because they don't get so, there's just no way around it. You get so drilled down into the details that sometimes you lose sight of the big picture, and sometimes you need that big picture. And I use my wife a lot. I'll just run a scenario by her, and she'll sometimes. I had a case one time. I don't do very many of them, but I did in this one case because I really felt sorry for the poor lady. And it was it was a medical malpractice, probably two that I've ever done in my life. And so this kid was delivered, had all kinds of problems. And the doctor had gone back in there and altered his medical chart to make it look, because she had come in complaining of pelvic pain during the pregnancy. And that was a huge issue, because if that complaint was there, then he should have done this CT and some of these other procedures and ultrasound and whatnot, and potentially even applied a suture. And so I came back home late. My wife had some of her friends over there from college, and they were in town, and they're having a glass of wine or something. And someone asked, "Well, what have you been doing?" I said, "Oh, I've been, working on this case." "Well, tell us a little bit about it." So I told them about it. And the first thing that one of the women there said was, "Well, how's the kid now?" And I said, "Kid's fine." And she said, "So what's the case about then?" And it was a big eye opener to me, because I was so focused on this doctor had gone in there and changed his chart, and, so evil and sinister. But people that would be on my jury, all they cared about was, if the kid's healthy, why are you in this lawsuit? And that was a big eye opener for me. And so I needed that. That was another non-products case example of, you can't ever lose sight of the big picture and what 12 people off the street sitting in that jury box are going to see. They're not going to see little things like the roll rate, how fast a car rolls over. All they're going to look at is, did it deploy? No. Should have deployed? Yes. Was she hurt? Yes. And in that case of the doctor, they don't care if the kid's fine. I mean, that's what everybody, and I realize that everybody, all they care about when they're going through having a child is a healthy child. They don't care what happened before then. If that child's healthy, that's all they care about. And
very interesting.
Yeah, so it was I have learned a whole lot from people by just keeping me focused on the big picture sometimes.
I love it. What resources, Shawn, or additional information would you recommend for those interested in learning more about product liability law?
Again, talking to products lawyers, and one of the first ones I did, this was 20 some years ago. I knew just enough to be dangerous. I knew that it was one of those fuel tanks outside the frame rails, and this poor kid burned to death. And the dad came to us about just the insurance on the vehicle, because it was a family member's vehicle. So there was going to be insurance, liability insurance and uninsured motorist insurance on that vehicle. That's the only reason he came to us, was for that. Which would have been, 25,000 or whatever it was. I keep staring at that police report. I'm thinking, man, why, this vehicle's not damaged that bad. I went and looked at the vehicle. I'm like, how this, the kid burned to death. And then I got the autopsy and the medical records, and I saw that there had been, soot in the lungs. And so that meant the kid was alive to breathe in the smoke. And so I just started thinking, man, there's something's not right here. And so I called a lawyer that did a lot of products liability work. And I said, look, I got this case. I want to, see what you think. But I said, I got one condition. I'm not going to refer it to you. I'm going to work it with you. And he agreed. And so I went to, we deposed all the people. We had an expert down in San Antonio, and we had the vehicle shipped down there in San Antonio. And I mean, we worked that thing for 2 years and got a great result for the family. And that was actually my start in it. And it was because I worked with a guy that did those. I'd like to think I would have done just great by myself, but again, I didn't know the experts. I mean, it's a little small fraternity of experts in this products liability world. And this lawyer knew. I got introduced to these experts. I've used them. I still use them to this day, because now they've known me, they've worked with me. And I don't know that I would have been able to get that case the same result that we got by having a guy that he had been doing it for 20 some years when I contacted him. And he even told me, he said, I'll be glad to, Shawn, I like you. But you're never going to hire me again after this case. And sadly, he was right.
I love it. How can listeners and viewers or anybody really get in touch with your firm if they have a question or need representation regarding a product liability issue?
Yeah, I'm out there. It's the website is danielsfirm.com, or you can call me anytime. I mean, I give people my cell number all the time that they can call. I mean, my number is 479-521-7000. And, we work anywhere. Doesn't have to be in Arkansas or Oklahoma. But yeah, I mean, I'm out there on the internet, and you can call anytime. I mean, I take calls on my cell phone nights, weekends, and that's just the way it is. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm always glad to help. And if somebody thinks that they've got a case, and it's not what they want to do, and they think it's a potential products case, I'd love for them to reach out to me.
Shawn, this was so great. I hope our discussion about the aspects of a product from shelf to courtroom and the journey of a product liability claim was informative and educational. And as promised, here's my pop-up question for you. You ready?
Okay.
What's the most surprising thing about your job that people wouldn't guess?
Uh, I, I would say it's at the end, when you get a successful resolution. I'm gonna give another boring story, but I had this mother, her daughter, she lost her daughter in a van rollover. Um, and we worked that thing. We took depositions in South Korea we were there for a week deposing all these design engineers in Korea. And she was the only child. She had her when she was 16 years old. And not only was it her daughter, but they were best friends. And they lived in a small town, little trailer. And I went, we finally got that thing resolved. And when I went to deliver the check, and sweet lady, but she smoked like a factory. And it just killing me. I'm sitting in this little house, just, my eyes are watering, and, getting smoke everywhere. And I should have been home by, it was a couple hours away from my house, and I should have been home, around 6 or 7 o'clock, and I didn't come home till 11. And my wife said, well, what took you so long? Did you have any trouble? I said, no, I just couldn't leave. I mean, it was this release of the resolution. And in these kind of cases, where you get these catastrophic losses, like in this case, she lost her daughter. It's like it's not over until the litigation's over. And she was going through that moment. I just couldn't leave. I just had to sit there, and she ended up feeding me supper and continue to smoke the whole time. But I just couldn't leave. I mean, and that's what I find is these cases, because you get so invested in them, and you're so invested with your client, and especially in the ones where there's been a horrific loss like that, that you're more than just their lawyer. I mean, they kind of look to you, and they finally get that closure, and they can't get it while this litigation is going. And it validates successful resolution of these kind of cases. It validates, that this shouldn't have happened. My family member meant something, and the manufacturer, should have done something different. And I've had some where the manufacturer has agreed to change their design. I've had some where they've agreed to put a warning on products, and that's been very satisfying. And I think kind of a big surprise, because usually you work them up, you go to trial, get a verdict, or you don't, or you get a settlement and everybody walks away and it's confidential and you can't ever say the amount or anything. But when you can make a change like that, where a product now has a warning to prevent the very incident that happened, so stop this from happening to the next one. And that's one of the things that mother that I was talking about, she did get a lot of relief out of that, because they did go back and change the design of the wheel that was causing this wheel to malfunction on the highway. And so she was comfortable knowing that maybe this wouldn't happen to the next mom or somebody in one of these, because they did change that design. And that was a big surprise. They don't do that very often. But when you can do something like that, you feel like you kind of help society. I don't know if that's what you were looking for, but
absolutely. Beautiful story. And thank you so much for everything you do every single day, Shawn. Again, that was Shawn Daniels with Daniels Law Firm in Arkansas and Oklahoma, and handling cases nationwide. I want to thank you all for listening and watching our story today. For more tips and tricks on legal funding and personal injury law and medicine related topics, follow me, download, like, and subscribe for It's Time for More Injury Funding podcast on several podcast platforms worldwide, and follow More Injury Funding on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Pinterest, YouTube, Google Business Profile, and my website at moreinjuryfunding.com. I can't wait to see you, my dear listeners and viewers, at my next upcoming episode. Tune in for our next guest soon. Until then, be well. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.